Hey everyone, I hope you're doing really well and you're keeping your head in your Holy Bible as the world continues to lose its tiny mind, it seems. As you know, we are working our way through the Old and New Testament in parallel, and in this episode, we're working through the New Testament and reading through the precious word and gospel of Matthew. We are up to chapter 14, and this is God's word. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him." For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, "Give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter." And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then this disciple came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. When it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "We have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish." He said, "Bring them here to me." Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there, but the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it's I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret, and when the men of that place recognized him, they sent out into all that surrounding region, brought to him all who were sick, and begged him that they might only touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched it were made perfectly well. This is the gospel of the Lord. And Dr Thomas Constable provides a commentary of Matthew 14, and he writes, "The opposition of Herod and his friends." Our gospel resumes the historical course of these revelations, but in such a manner as to exhibit the spirit by which the people were animated. At that time is again a loose connective not intended to communicate chronological sequence necessarily. Herod Antipas lived primarily at Tiberias on the west shore of Galilee. However, if all the events described in this story happened on one day, as seems likely, they must have taken place at Herod's residence at the Machaerus fortress in southern Perea east of the Dead Sea. Antipas ruled over Galilee and Perea from 4 BC to AD 39, namely during almost all of Jesus' earthly life. Word about Jesus' ministry had reached Herod. Herod had previously beheaded John the Baptist for criticizing his morality. Herod could do this because John had ministered within Herod's jurisdiction. Public opinion evidently encouraged Herod to conclude that Jesus was John the Baptist who had come back to life. He attributed Jesus' miracles to the supposedly resurrected John. The idea of a ghostly or even physical return of someone who has had a special influence, especially if that influence has been prematurely cut off by violent death, is found in various cultures. Think of Elijah, Nero, King Arthur, and Elvis. The synoptic writers ascribed moral and religious motives to Herod for executing John. Josephus wrote that Herod beheaded John for political reasons. Probably both reasons led Herod to act as he did. Herod Antipas had two brothers named Philip. The one that Matthew referred to here was Herod Philip first. The other brother named Philip was Herod Philip II, tetrarch of Euteria, Trachonitis, Gaulanitis, Batanea, and Penaeus. Philip I was Herod Antipas's half-brother. Therefore, Antipas's marriage to Philip's wife Herodias was incestuous, in addition to being adulterous. Evidently, John had repeatedly rebuked Antipas, in view of the Greek verb used in verse 4. Herodias was also Antipas's niece, but this in itself would have been no problem for John, since the law did not forbid uncles marrying their nieces. Combining the synoptic accounts, Antipas appears to have been a weak man, controlled by a wicked and ruthless wife. Interestingly, John, the latter-day Elijah, faced the modern counterparts of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel in Antipas and Herodias. Unfortunately, Herodias succeeded where Jezebel had failed. The day of celebration was probably Herod's birthday, though Edersheim noted that this Greek word could refer to the anniversary of his accession to the throne. Probably seen as pretentious by commoners, birthdays were celebrated by the wealthy and the powerful. Since food and drink were in short supply, most people feasted only during holy festivals and weddings. Rulers and the wealthy, however, celebrated their birthdays with feasting. Herodias' daughter by her previous marriage to Philip I was Salome, who was then between 12 and 14 years old. The idea that her dance was sensuous, though probably true, does not come from the text, but from the reputation of the Herodians for low morals, and from the low status of dancing girls. Antipas was only a petty monarch, but he acted like one of the powerful Persian kings. Antipas was wrong to keep his oath, which he evidently repeated more than once, and he was wrong to keep it. He feared losing face with his dinner guests. The Romans practiced decapitation. That form of execution was not Jewish. Likewise, the Romans executed certain prisoners without a trial, whereas Jewish law required one. The gore of this scene testifies to the hard-hearted condition of the Roman royal family and their courtiers. As the last of the Old Testament prophets, John suffered a martyr's death, as did several of his predecessors. Death, the temporary end of physical life, is not the worst enemy of humanity. Alienation from God is, and thus those who murdered John are far more pitiable than John himself. Matthew's notation that Jesus heard about John's death unites John and Jesus against this political enemy. It also suggests that John's disciples still had high regard for Jesus. As Herod had heard the news about Jesus, now Jesus heard the news about John. John's disciples risked guilt by association when they came to Herod's castle to retrieve the baptizer's headless body and bury it according to Jewish custom. Herod's testimony to the supernatural character of Jesus' miracles is important in Matthew's unfolding theme of people's perceptions of the king. Likewise, the forerunner's unjust execution at the hands of hard-hearted Roman officials foreshadows the fate of the king. Matthew evidently recorded these verses to show how Roman political leaders viewed the king and his forerunner. Opposition against him was intense, mainly for religious and moral reasons. Matthew so connected the ministries of these two men that what happened to one was viewed as having a direct effect on the other. Herod, by rejecting the king's forerunner, was rejecting the king who followed him. Having experienced strong rejection from the common people and from the nation's political leaders, Jesus withdrew in order to train his disciples further. In view of the coming conflict, they needed stronger faith in him. Jesus cultivated their faith with two miracles. Matthew's record of this miracle, which all four Gospels contain, stresses Jesus' power to create, his compassion, and the disciples' responsibility to minister to multitudes as Jesus' representatives. It also foreshadows the coming earthly kingdom banquet. The simple meal that Jesus provided on this occasion, in a wholesome setting, contrasts with Herod's lavish feast in a degenerate setting just described. Since verses 3 through 12 are in one sense a digression, the opening words of this pericope must refer to Herod's response to Jesus' ministry. When Jesus heard of John's death, he withdrew from Herod's territory and his animosity. Evidently, Jesus believed that Herod Antipas would also oppose him, just as he had opposed his forerunner. As previously in verse 15 and later in chapter 15, Jesus withdrew from a place of danger and confrontation. However, Jesus could not escape the crowds that followed him wherever he went. The secluded place where Jesus retreated was evidently near Bethsaida Julias on Galilee's northeast shore. Jesus travelled there from Capernaum by boat, but the crowds beat him there on foot, having learned where he was going. They would have walked east along the northern coast of the Sea of Galilee. Matthew again noted the great compassion of the king. In view of the context and the meaning of evening, the time must have been late afternoon. There were several small towns within walking distance of this region where the people could have bought their own suppers. Jesus' directions turned the disciples' attention to their own resources. By urging them to consider these, Jesus was leading them to recognize their personal inadequacy and to appeal to him as the only adequate resource. There is nothing in the text or context that suggests that the number of the loaves and fishes had symbolic significance, though many of the commentators have thought so. Jesus' act of looking heavenward, thanking God, and then breaking the loaves were normal for the head of any Jewish household. Jesus then performed the miracle. He created enough bread and fish to feed the assembled throng. With 5,000 men present, the total size of the crowd may have been 10,000 to 20,000, counting only the males had Old Testament precedent. Everyone had enough to eat and felt satisfied. Jesus' provision was so abundant that there were 12 large wicker baskets full of scraps left over, even after many thousands had eaten all that they had wanted. Evidently, each of the 12 disciples had a large basket and circulated among the crowd, collecting the leftovers until his basket was full. This sign was very important to three groups: the disciples, the believing remnant, and the wonder-watching unbelievers. From now on, the miracles are primarily for the benefit of the disciples in that they are designed to instruct them. But in addition, they confirm the faith of those who believe and the unbelief of the unbelieving masses. That they are for the disciples' training is seen in the fact that the rejection of the Lord is evident. The cities in which he had performed most of his mighty works had already indicated their apathy and opposition. He had left the masses so that he could be apart with the disciples. Jesus' training of the disciples is evident in his questioning them and his using them as his agents. The significance of this miracle was intended primarily for the disciples. Jesus was illustrating the kind of ministry they would have after his departure. They would be involved in feeding people, but with spiritual food. The source for their feeding would be the Lord himself. When their supply ran out, as with the bread and fish, they would need to return to the Lord for more. He would supply them, but the feeding would be done through them. The Jews had a traditional belief that when Messiah came, he would feed the people with bread from heaven, like Moses had done. Elisha had also miraculously fed 100 men. This miracle proved Jesus' ability to provide for Israel as her king. However, in contrast to the manna, here there was bread left over. Also, this miracle probably reminded the spiritually perceptive in the crowd of the messianic banquet that the Old Testament predicted Messiah would provide. Jesus walking on the water. Jesus proceeded to do a second miracle to deepen his disciples' faith in him even more. As soon as the people had finished eating, Jesus immediately compelled his disciples to enter a boat and depart for the other side of the lake. There appear to have been several reasons for his unusual command. First, his miracle appears to have refueled the enthusiasm of some in the crowd to draft Jesus and to force him to lead the nation. Perhaps Jesus wanted to spare his disciples from this attractive temptation. Second, Jesus wanted to get away to pray. Third, he wanted to get some rest. Fourth, he had an important lesson to teach them. There are two kinds of storms of correction, when God disciplines us, and storms of perfection, when God helps us to grow. Jonah was in a storm because he disobeyed God and had to be corrected. The disciples were in a storm because they obeyed Christ and had to be perfected. Evidently, Jesus sent the disciples up the eastern Galilee coast toward Bethsaida, Julius, with orders to wait for him, but not beyond a certain time. He planned to travel north by foot. They proceeded west across the lake by boat when he did not appear by the prearranged deadline. After dismissing the crowd, Jesus walked up the hillside in order to pray. There are no real mountains in this part of the Galilee coastline, but there are hills that slope down to the lake. Jesus evidently stayed on the hillside longer than he had led the disciples to conclude that he would. Perhaps he prayed about the crowd's attempts to make him king, among other things. The word evening, as the Jews used it, covers a period from late afternoon to shortly after sunset. Obviously, it was now late in that evening period. By this time, the boat that the disciples were in was quite a long distance out from the shore. A storm had arisen, and the winds were probably blowing from the west, as was typical, evidently forcing them away from the northern shore and impeding their progress to the west. The Jews divided the night from sunset to sunrise into 3 watches. The Romans, however, divided into 4. Matthew used the Roman division of watches. The 4th watch of the night was between 3 and 6 a.m. Jesus had spent most of the night praying, and the disciples had spent most of the night rowing. Before the fall, God had ordained that man rule over the sea. Here Jesus was doing precisely that. He was fulfilling God's purpose for humankind. This action gave testimony to his being the second Adam, the man who succeeded where Adam had failed. The Old Testament speaks of God walking on or through the sea. Some translators rendered the Greek word phantasma as ghost, but it means an apparition, namely an optical illusion or distorted appearance. The disciples saw Jesus, but to them his appearance resembled that of a ghost. Perhaps rain or fog was responsible for this, as well as poor light. They may have believed the popular superstition that evil spirits lived in the sea and that those who were drowned haunted the water. Jesus' response centered on, "It is I." Note the chiasm of his response. The disciples could take courage and not fear because Jesus was there. The words "I am" were a term Jesus used to claim deity. The 4th Gospel stressed Jesus' use of this term especially. The disciples may not have realized his claim in the terror of the moment, but later they undoubtedly saw the significance of what he had said more clearly. Fear is unwarranted where Jesus is present. This is the first of 3 occasions in which Matthew recorded that Peter received special treatment. The evangelist here presents Peter in all of his impetuosity mixed with his great devotion. In keeping with Matthew's style of writing, these traits, which are first mentioned here, characterize Peter throughout the remainder of the Gospel. More significant is the fact that the place of preeminence among the apostles, which Peter here assumes is never lost in the rest of Matthew's Gospel. The man who said, "Bid me come to thee," was just the man to say, "Lord, I am ready to go with thee, both into prison and to death." The scene on the lake was but a foreshadowing or rehearsal of Peter's fall. It seems almost incredible that Peter could have believed that he could walk on water. However, the disciples had already done many mighty miracles because Jesus had given them the power to do so. We could translate the first-class condition in the Greek text rendered, if it is you, as since it is you. Peter evidently wanted to be as close to Jesus as he possibly could, as often as possible. With remarkable trust, Peter climbed over the side of the boat and began walking on the water. He too, in obedience to Jesus' command, was able to fulfill man's destiny by subduing the sea. He was doing well until he became more concerned about the waves than about Jesus. Seeing the wind is a figure of speech for seeing the storm. His distressing circumstances distracted his attention and weakened his faith in Jesus. Jesus rebuked Peter for his weak or little faith, even though it was stronger than that of the other disciples who remained in the boat. Jesus used this rebuke to help Peter and the other disciples to see that consistent confidence in himself was absolutely necessary. Peter became both a good example and a bad one. Jesus rescued him like God had rescued many others from watery graves. The stilling of the wind is not the climax of the story. The disciples' worship of Jesus is. This is the first time that they address Jesus with his full title, God's Son, or Son of God. This was a new high for the disciples in their appreciation of Jesus' person. Retrospectively, the disciples, in making this confession, are giving answer to the earlier question they had raised in an equally perilous situation at sea. What sort of man is this, that even wind and sea obey him? In view of their later lapses, the disciples evidently understood this title in the messianic sense, but their understanding was still not very mature. Perhaps, too, their confession here arose from the drama of the moment, whereas later they may have forgotten what they had spoken so truly about Jesus before. Several important lessons can be learned from this account. Courage comes from knowing that Jesus is present. The answer to fear is faith, and faith is best placed in the one who is identified as the I Am. Doubt is an evidence of a divided mind. Confessing Jesus' divine sonship is evidence of faith. This short section, as in the public ministry at Gennesaret, summarizes Jesus' public ministry at this stage of his ministry. It shows that even though Jesus was withdrawing from unbelievers and giving special attention to the training of his disciples, he still had time to minister to people who were in need. Gennesaret was the name of a plain on the northwest coast of the Sea of Galilee. There was also a village called Gennesaret on this coastal plain, probably very close to the modern tower of Ginosar. The crowds there recognized Jesus instantly when he got out of the boat, and they brought all types of needy people to him for healing. Many of them believed that touching the border of Jesus' cloak would heal them. The woman with a hemorrhage had also obtained healing from Jesus after touching the border of his cloak. Now many others pressed on him with similar faith and found healing. The faith of the disciples contrasts with the faith of these people, which was much greater. These few verses do three things. They show the continuing broad appeal of Jesus' ministry. They show that Jesus continued to minister to the multitudes even though he concentrated his ministry on his disciples. And Jesus showed no concern with becoming ritually unclean through his contacts with the common people. He made people clean rather than becoming unclean himself from these contacts. This last feature sets the stage for the confrontation over clean and unclean in the next pericope. And those are all the words of Dr. Thomas Constable, a wonderful commentary as always, and I'll leave those commentary notes, link to that in the show notes. That is a mouthful. Thanks, guys. Today's daily devotion from Dr. Charles Stanley is titled Coming Storms, and it's based on 1 Peter chapter 1. Prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And Dr. Stanley writes, in the Christian life, it's important for us to be on the watch for the storms that will arise. The trials will come, but what can you do when you recognize a tempest is headed your way? First, remove any hindrance. Make sure you're right with God and get rid of anything that interferes with your relationship with him. If you can't hear the Lord clearly, then you're not going to be able to obey him. Second, keep balanced in your judgment. Don't panic or look for temporary solutions. Stay in Scripture and trust God to give you discernment about what to do. Third, recognize that your hope is in Christ. Rest in him and remember that God has a divine purpose for allowing this storm. Finally, make being more like Jesus your goal. No matter what happens, set your heart to act like him. You can be prepared for the storms of life, and how you respond can make a tremendous difference. So don't just survive the tempest, make it your goal to triumph in it. Jesus, help me prepare for the storm so you will be glorified in them. Amen. Guys, until we meet again next time, keep your eyes on Jesus and your head in the Word. And as always, I pray for each and every one of you. And I also pray Maranatha. Take care, guys.